The explosion was not the kind of thing you saw coming. 1 second the corridor was humming with the distant pulse of the reactor's stabilizers, and the next it was screaming with ruptured airlocks, tearing metal, and the flash of detonation that turned light into pain. He didn't think. Not really. Instinct was faster than thought, and instinct made him throw himself forward between the fragments of a disintegrating bulkhead and the fragile figure who had been standing too close to it. He caught a glimpse of her wide eyes, luminous and silver in the half-light before the shrapnel hit. It punched into him like knives thrown by gods. A dozen searing impacts tore through his side, his arm, his chest, and the sound that left his throat was swallowed by the pressure wave. He didn't hear her scream. He didn't hear anything after the second heartbeat. Just black. Then, consciousness. Again. Not the slow drift of recovery in a human med bay, not the clinical smell of antiseptic, not the familiar beeping of Earth-made machines. This was different. The first thing he noticed was the air. It carried a taste, like clean metal mixed with ozone, but softened by something floral, like crushed leaves. The second was the sound, a murmur of voices that didn't belong to any. Human crew he knew. They were lighter, higher, threaded with tones that carried meanings his brain couldn't quite untangle. The third was the pressure around him, not the weight of sheets, but a cocoon of warmth, like gel or light, that held him without crushing. He opened his eyes. The world above him was carved in light, smooth surfaces that looked grown, not built, curved into an arch that glowed faintly with shifting colors. Around him stood figures, 4, maybe 5, all with the same faintly luminous skin, each pair of silver eyes watching him intently. He knew them, or rather, he knew the one who now pressed forward, breaking through the ring of onlookers. Her, the girl, the one he had shielded. She was alive. That was enough to make the pain retreat, at least for a heartbeat. Her face leaned into his vision, close enough for him to see the faint patterns along her cheeks, like veins of light beneath her skin. She said something. Her voice was like bells struck underwater, soft, untranslatable. He tried to speak. His throat felt raw, but sound rasped out. "You're safe." Her expression changed, lips parting, and then she looked over her shoulder to one of the others, a hand extended, graceful and long-fingered, adjusting something on a panel of living light nearby. The cocoon around his body pulsed, and with it came a rush of warmth that dulled the pain in his chest. He let his head sink back. Shrapnel. He remembered. It had torn into him. By all rights, he should have been dead. And yet, he wasn't. He tried again, voice weaker. "Where am I?" The girl glanced back at him, those silver eyes softening as if she wanted desperately to answer, but lacked the words. One of the others stepped closer. Taller, older, maybe male, and spoke in a rhythm that felt closer to language. It washed over him like waves breaking on a shore, and though he didn't understand, something in it felt steady, reassuring. Then the girl reached for him. Tentative, careful. Her fingers brushed his hand, and he was surprised to find her touch, cool, almost electrically so, like static dancing across his skin. She held his gaze, and for the first time since the explosion, he felt grounded, alive. And that's when the truth settled in his chest like another shard of shrapnel. He wasn't on his ship anymore. He wasn't even in human territory. He was surrounded by aliens, aliens who had saved him. The first coherent thought he managed was that he should be dead. He'd felt the shrapnel tear through him. He remembered the sensation with too much clarity, the sharp heat of it punching past ribs, the way his arm had gone numb instantly, the wetness that had spread across his uniform. He'd gone down hard, and the last thing he had seen was her, frozen, standing against the glare of the explosion. He hadn't thought. There hadn't been time to think. Just move, shield her, protect her, And yet here he was, his chest rising and falling, his lungs working without agony, though he could still feel echoes of it, like ghost pain lurking beneath the surface. He turned his head slightly, wincing as he moved. The alien girl was still watching him. Not just watching, studying, as though each flicker of his expression mattered to her in some critical way. Her hair, if it could be called that, shifted like strands of glassy fiber, catching the light and refracting it into subtle colors. She looked young, though he had no basis for measuring age among her kind. Her hand remained on his, tentative but steady. He tried to speak again, though his voice was barely more than a rasp. "What happened to me?" The taller alien spoke. Again, words rolling in a cadence that was almost hypnotic. None of it made sense. But when the girl replied to him, softer, shorter, the man seemed to nod, and then he gestured toward the cocoon surrounding the human's body. Only now did he realize that he was half suspended in it, weightless, his limbs cushioned in a gel-like medium that glowed faintly from within. Wounds that should have been torn and ragged were instead closed with neat seams of light, tiny tendrils weaving through his skin like threads. It wasn't stitching. It was something far beyond stitching. His heart stuttered at the thought. They weren't just keeping him alive. They were repairing him. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat making it difficult. "You saved me?" The girl tilted her head as though parsing the intent behind the words. Then, very carefully, she echoed him, her voice imperfectly forming the syllables, each one shaped as though it cost her effort. Ved. It startled him, hearing a fragment of his own language from her lips. The others in the room stirred at the attempt, exchanging glances that conveyed something unspoken. But the girl leaned closer, repeating it more clearly this time. "Saved." He blinked, heart hammering. She was trying. She had remembered. "Yeah," he whispered, forcing a smile through the exhaustion weighing him down. "Saved." She didn't smile back. Not exactly. Her kind might not express emotions, in the same ways humans did, but the brightness in her eyes softened, the light beneath her skin pulsing faintly, and that was enough. For a while, the chamber was quiet except for the hum of whatever kept the cocoon alive. He drifted in and out, waking to see her still there, sometimes alone, sometimes with others who checked strange panels of woven light, touched the edges of his wounds, or murmured in their strange language. Each time he faded, he wondered if he'd wake again. Each time he did, she was still by his side. On the third time waking, clarity began to return. He remembered the mission, the survey ship, the neutral system, the unexpected hostile contact. He remembered alarms, the scramble to evacuate civilians, the girl among them. She had been separated from her people, trapped, vulnerable. He had seen her and acted without hesitation. And then, the explosion. Now he was here. Not in a human ship, not in any medbay he knew. Surrounded by her kind, who by all rights should have left him behind. One of the others approached, the taller male again, though it was difficult to tell for sure if gender meant the same among them. His silver eyes regarded the human with calm detachment before he extended a slender device from his hand. It hovered, humming faintly, scanning along the human's chest. A moment later, images bloomed in the air, shapes of ribs, fragments of shrapnel dissolving into nothing, veins resealing. The human exhaled slowly. "Jesus," he muttered. The tall one tilted his head at the sound. The girl spoke to him, her tone carrying a trace of urgency. He replied, lower, steadier, and then moved away. The human turned his gaze back to her. "Do you understand me?" She hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head. But after a pause, she touched her chest lightly and said a word, short, lilting her name. It was like music compressed into 2 syllables, and though he knew he'd never reproduce it perfectly, he tried. His broken attempt made her skin pulse, faintly with light again, and she repeated the gesture, pointing at him this time. He understood. "Daniel," he said hoarsely. "My name is Daniel." She echoed it, the pronunciation imperfect but recognizable. Neil, he chuckled, despite the ache in his ribs. Close enough. Something shifted between them then, something fragile but undeniable. A bridge of words, however thin, had begun to form. Time passed, minutes, hours, maybe longer. The cocoon continued its silent work, and with each cycle of drifting and waking, Daniel felt stronger. The pain dulled to an ache, his breathing steadied, and the sense of impending death retreated like a shadow before the light. And with strength came questions. Why had they saved him? Humanity's encounters with alien civilizations had been rare, and not all had been friendly. Too often, fear and mistrust governed first contact, and more than one diplomat had paid the price for cultural missteps. For these people, her people, to not only rescue him but devote such care to healing him, it meant something important. The girl, he still clung to her name in his memory, though it slipped through his human tongue like water, stayed close. Sometimes she spoke softly to him, though the words remained indecipherable. Sometimes she simply sat, watching, her hand resting on the edge of the cocoon as if anchoring him to this reality. And though the others came and went, it was her presence he clung to. On one waking, she brought something with her. A sphere, faintly glowing, cradled in her hands. She touched it to the edge of the cocoon, and it shimmered, then opened, revealing a projection of light. Shapes formed, images. A ship, fractured and burning, a corridor collapsing, a human figure, him, throwing himself forward, and her, caught in the blast's glare. He swallowed hard. They had seen it. They had recorded it. The projection froze. On the moment of impact, his body shielding hers. She reached out, fingers brushing the frozen image of his sacrifice. Then she looked at him, eyes wide with something he finally recognized. Not just gratitude, something deeper, understanding. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed. He hadn't thought. He hadn't calculated the cost. He had simply acted, because that was what you did. You protected the vulnerable. You put yourself between danger and someone who couldn't withstand it. That was what it meant to be human. When he opened his eyes again, she was still watching. Him. And for the first time since the explosion, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a prisoner here. Maybe he was something else. A guest, a survivor, or perhaps something more. He woke to silence, and for the first time since opening his eyes in this alien place, the girl was not beside him. The chamber seemed larger without her presence, emptier, though the cocoon still pulsed faintly with its healing rhythm. Daniel shifted, testing his strength. His arms no longer felt like lead, though stiffness gripped his muscles. The wounds that should have crippled him had become faint scars, glowing faintly under the alien light. He reached toward the edge of the cocoon, and this time, his fingers met resistance, not of liquid, but of air. The membrane that had held him had dissolved while he slept. He was free. Slowly, carefully, he sat up. The world tilted briefly before righting itself. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, but his body beneath it felt whole. Weak, yes, but whole. He swung his legs over the side, bare feet touching the floor. It was warm, almost alive beneath him, like stepping onto the skin of some massive beast. The door, if it was a door, shifted open with no sound, and she entered. Relief hit him harder than expected. He hadn't realized how much he depended on her presence until that moment. Her silver eyes brightened when she saw him sitting upright. She spoke quickly, words flowing in her melodic tongue, and though he understood none of it, the cadence carried meaning, surprise, approval, maybe even pride. She approached swiftly, her hands reaching as if to steady him, but she stopped short, hesitant, not wanting to overstep. "I'm okay," he said, voice rough. He tried a small smile. "Better than okay, thanks to you." She tilted her head, parsing his tone, then repeated softly, "Okay." It startled him again, hearing her shape his words. Each time she tried, she grew more precise, more confident. He wondered if her kind were natural mimics, or if this effort was entirely her own. Either way, it was progress. She gestured, for him to follow, and though his legs protested, Daniel forced himself upright. The chamber swayed around him for a moment, but her presence steadied him. Step by step, they moved together into the corridor beyond. It was like walking inside, a living organism, walls curved organically, veins of light pulsing faintly within them. The air shifted with each movement, as though the structure breathed. Other figures passed, pausing to glance at him, some with curiosity, others with cool detachment. None interfered. It struck him then that he wasn't restrained, wasn't guarded. They trusted him, or at least she did. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, and the sight stole his breath. It was a city contained within the ship, or perhaps the ship was the city. Structures rose like coral formations, arching and spiraling, each glowing with inner light. Pathways crossed through the air, suspended as if by unseen hands, and figures moved gracefully along them. The scale dwarfed any human station he had ever seen. Daniel stopped, staring, overwhelmed. The girl paused beside him, watching his reaction. She said something softly, her tone reverent, as though naming what he saw. He could only shake his head slowly, awed. "You live in this?" he whispered. She didn't answer, but her eyes told him enough. Yes, this was her world. They moved forward, descending into the heart of the city ship. Everywhere, eyes followed him, some curious, some cautious, some openly distrustful. He felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken question of why a human walked among them, alive. But the girl stayed close, her presence shielding him as surely as he had shielded her. At last, they entered another chamber, smaller but grand in its own way. A dais of woven light dominated the center, and upon it stood figures taller, older, more imposing than any he had seen yet. Their eyes burned with authority. The girl spoke quickly to them, her voice carrying urgency. Daniel stood silently, uncertain. He could feel their scrutiny on him, weighing, judging. One of them, clearly a leader, stepped forward, speaking in deep tones. The words meant nothing, but the gravity of them was unmistakable. Daniel cleared, his throat searching for something to bridge the gap. "I don't understand you," he admitted softly. "But I want to." The leader regarded him coolly, then gestured to the girl. She stepped closer, her hands producing the glowing sphere once more. She touched it, and images bloomed in the air. The explosion, his sacrifice, his body shielding hers. The leaders watched silently as the moment replayed, frozen in time. Then, the image shifted. The human ship appeared, burning, crippled. Escape pods ejecting, enemy fire raking across its hull. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. His people, his crew. Were they alive? Did any make it out? The leaders spoke among themselves, voices measured, thoughtful. At last one turned back to him, extending a hand, not in greeting, but in offering. A projection bloomed above it, a map of the sector, marked with symbols. One of them glowed where his ship had been destroyed. Another, brighter, pulsed further, out. Daniel stared. He didn't need translation to understand. His people. Survivors. He looked at the girl, heart racing. You know where they are. She couldn't understand the words, but she saw the hope in his eyes. Slowly, she nodded. His throat tightened. If they knew where the survivors were, then maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to get back to them. But why show him this? Why save him at all? What did they want in return? The answer came unspoken, in the way the leader's eyes lingered on him, the way their gazes flicked to the girl. He realized with sudden clarity, his act had not only saved her life, it had changed something fundamental. A human had laid down his body for one of their own, and now, whether he liked it or not, that meant something to them. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a symbol. That realization carried a weight heavier than any shrapnel. The girl touched his arm gently, drawing his gaze back to her. Her silver eyes softened, and she whispered his name, halting but clear. Daniel. Hearing it from her lips, shaped carefully, almost reverently, made his chest tighten. In that moment, surrounded by alien eyes, in a ship that was a city, he felt a bond stronger than words could capture. But the bond was also a tether, and he knew with growing certainty that it would pull him into something larger than survival, something that might determine not only his fate, but the fragile thread between humanity and her people. For the first time since the explosion, Daniel felt the stirrings of fear. Not for his life, but for what it might mean to be the man who had thrown himself into the fire for an alien girl. And as the leaders spoke again, their voices rising like a tide, he understood one thing with perfect clarity. Whatever came next, he was no longer just Daniel, a soldier, a man who acted on instinct. He was something more in their eyes. He just wasn't sure yet if that was salvation or a burden he could never escape. Days blurred into one another, though he wasn't sure how time was even measured here. There were no shifts of day or night, only the soft pulse of the living walls and the gentle rhythm of the ship city itself. Daniel walked again, strength, returning, each step less fragile than the last. Wherever he went, she was there. At first, their communication remained halting. He'd speak slowly. She'd mimic, sometimes getting the sounds close, sometimes not. She'd speak back, offering her words for things, pointing to objects, to places, to herself. It was the oldest language exchange in the universe, gesture, repetition, patience. But the look in her eyes each time he understood something new was worth more than any advanced translator could provide. He learned her name, properly this time. Not just the sound he had butchered in his human throat, but the true resonance of it. It vibrated in the air, half music, half light. He still couldn't reproduce it perfectly, but when he tried, she laughed. An actual laugh, high and crystalline, like glass bells shattering softly. He decided then that if he had to embarrass himself 1,000 times just to hear that sound again, he would. She learned his words faster than he learned hers. Daniel. Safe. Friend. Simple at first, then more complex. You. Save me! Her phrasing was broken, but the intent shone through. He corrected gently, guiding her mouth into the shapes. She repeated with determination until she mastered it. You saved me. He nodded, throat tight. I'd do it again. Her luminous gaze softened, and she touched her chest, a gesture that seemed to carry weight in her culture. Maybe gratitude. Maybe something more. The city ship revealed itself to him slowly. He saw how their technology wasn't separate from their environment, but intertwined with it, alive in ways human engineers would kill to understand. Lights that grew like vines, pathways that shifted underfoot, machines that responded to thought, to touch. to presence. Everything seemed to sing in harmony, as though the ship itself was aware, but he also saw the shadows, patrols that moved with precision, eyes wary, weapons at the ready, doors sealed with layers of energy, guarding sections. Of the ship he was not allowed to see. Conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room. The weight of distrust still hung heavy among her people, no matter what she believed about him, and always, always the looming question. Why had they saved him at all? Why keep him alive, heal him, show him survivors of his crew? The leaders had not explained, not in words he could understand. But their eyes had told him enough. He was useful, valuable. His sacrifice had bought him a place here, but also chained him to expectations he couldn't yet define. One evening, if evening, it could be called, she led him higher into the city ship to a chamber open to the stars. Daniel froze at the sight. Beyond the transparent dome stretched the cosmos, a sea of fire and ice, scattered with nebulae and the cold brilliance of distant suns. His breath caught. For all his years in the service, for all the stations and ships and ports he had passed through, he had never seen a view like this. She stood beside him, silent, watching his reaction. He realized then that for her, this was home. The endless expanse wasn't just background to a mission, it was the very fabric of her existence. Beautiful, he whispered. She tilted her head, not knowing the word. He repeated it slowly, then gestured outward. Beautiful, she echoed, halting, then more surely. Beautiful. Her voice carried wonder, as though she had never thought to name it before. They stood together in silence, the gulf between species shrinking with each shared word. But peace never lasted. It was on his 7th day, at least by his own count, that the alarms sounded. Not human alarms, no blaring klaxons or flashing red lights. These were deeper, resonant vibrations that thrummed through the walls, through his bones. The ship shifted, alive with tension. Figures moved quickly, urgently, their voices sharp. The girl grabbed his arm, eyes wide. She spoke rapidly, but he couldn't catch the meaning. She tugged, pulling him back toward the inner chambers. But before they reached safety, the corridor ahead sealed, walls folding closed like the closing of an iris. She cursed, at least he assumed it was a curse by the sharpness of her tone, and spun, dragging him down a side passage. "Wait," he said, stumbling to keep up. "What's happening?" She didn't answer, couldn't. The ship itself answered instead. Through a viewport, he saw them, ships, dark and angular, cutting through the void. Enemy vessels, the same kind that had destroyed his. His blood ran cold. She saw his face and nodded sharply, confirming what he already knew. The enemy had found them. They ducked into another chamber where others were gathered, weapons gleaming with energy that pulsed like living fire. The girl pushed him behind her, as though shielding him now, but he shook his head. He wasn't helpless. Not anymore. "Give me something," he urged, gesturing to the weapons. "I can fight." She turned, eyes flashing, and for a moment he thought she would refuse. But then she spoke a single word, one he understood without translation. "No." Her hand gripped his wrist tightly, and in her eyes he saw not distrust, but fear. Not of him. For him. The chamber shook violently, the distant roar of impacts reverberating through the walls. The city ship trembled like a living thing in pain, screams, orders, chaos. Daniel clenched his fists, useless, torn between instinct to fight and the reality that he was unarmed, out of place, a liability. She held him tighter, as though afraid he would throw himself into the fire again. He wanted to tell her he would, if it meant saving her. He wanted to tell her that was what humans did, what he did. But the words stuck in his throat. He had already proven it once. She already knew. And as the city ship reeled under the enemy assault, as stars flickered and the void filled with fire, Daniel understood the truth he had been avoiding. His sacrifice had bound them together, and there would be no path forward without both of them standing in the fire again. The ship trembled again, harder this time, sending a ripple through the chamber that nearly knocked him off his feet. The alien warriors braced themselves against the living walls, voices raised in sharp, clipped tones that carried command and urgency. He didn't need translation to know what was being said. Brace, defend, prepare. Daniel's heart pounded. The view of the enemy ships still burned in his mind. Dark, angular predators tearing through space. The same ones that had gutted his crew, that had scattered survivors into the void. Rage and helplessness boiled in his chest. The girl gripped, his wrist still, her luminous skin flickering faintly as though her body itself was responding to the ship's fear. Her silver eyes locked on his, pleading silently. Stay safe, don't do what you did before. But Daniel shook his head. He couldn't just stand here while others fought and died around him. That wasn't who he was. That wasn't who humans were. Another tremor rocked the chamber, followed by a blinding pulse of light that made half the warriors stagger. Something had hit the shields, or broken them. A voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the walls, and suddenly the chamber doors unfolded. A squad of warriors poured through, motioning frantically. The girl spoke quickly, urgently, to one of them. Their eyes flicked toward Daniel, then back to her. A heated exchange followed, voices rising, gestures sharp. Daniel caught none of it, but he understood the body language. They didn't want him involved. She did. Finally, the squad leader hissed something and turned away. She exhaled, shoulders dropping, then spun back to Daniel, grabbing his arm. She pulled him with her into the corridor, away from safety, toward the heart of the ship's defenses. They moved quickly, the organic corridors vibrating with each distant impact. At last, they emerged into a vast chamber that seemed to pulse with energy. He realized with awe that this was no ordinary room. It was the ship's heart, the core. Energy flowed in streams of light across the walls, converging into a massive structure at the center, alive with power. Warriors worked feverishly at its base, hands moving across controls that seemed to grow from the walls themselves. The girl released his arm and gestured sharply at him to wait. Then she rushed forward, speaking to a cluster of leaders who stood near the core. Daniel watched, tense, as they argued, her voice urgent, theirs skeptical. She pointed back at him. At first they shook their heads, but then the ship shuddered. Again, harder than before, and one of them cursed, turning sharply to look at him. Daniel stepped forward, meeting their eyes. He didn't know their words, but he knew how to speak without them. He placed a hand against his chest, then pointed outward, toward the void. He mimed holding a weapon, firing, standing strong. His voice carried steady despite the chaos. Let me fight. Silence. Then the girl spoke again, softer this time. One of the leaders, an elder with eyes like polished steel, studied him for a long, piercing moment. Finally, he extended a hand. Not in dismissal, but in offering. From the wall. Itself, a weapon grew, pulled from the living material like fruit from a tree. Sleek, alive with light, it pulsed faintly as though waiting for a heartbeat to sync with. Daniel stepped forward, wrapping his hand around it. The weapon responded instantly, light flaring brighter, harmonizing with the rhythm of his pulse. Gasps rippled through the chamber. The leader's expression hardened, but he gave a single nod. The girl's eyes shone as she stepped closer, whispering his name. And then there was no more time. The walls of the chamber split open to reveal a view of the battlefield outside. The city ship's defenses flared, beams of energy lashing out into the void. Enemy vessels swarmed like carrion birds, sleek and merciless. Smaller ships darted closer, latching onto the city's hull, drilling through. Alarms thrummed deeper. The enemy was boarding. Daniel raised the weapon, its weight unfamiliar yet natural, as though it had been shaped for him. The girl moved to his side, her own weapon blossoming from the wall, glowing with her touch. For a heartbeat, they looked at each other. No words passed. None were needed. And then the enemy came. The first breach erupted in a shower of molten light as the walls split. Figures poured through, angular, armored, their movements jagged and insect-like. Daniel fired. The weapon kicked with a pulse that rippled up his arm, a bolt of searing energy lancing out and tearing through the nearest invader. It dissolved into shards of blackened armor and ash. The girl fired beside him, her aim precise, her movements fluid. Together they carved a line through the first wave, the chamber filling with blinding light and alien screams. Warriors joined them, voices raised in battle cries that reverberated through the walls. The ship itself seemed to pulse harder, responding to the fight. Daniel moved on instinct, body remembering the rhythm of combat. Dive, fire, cover. He shouted once, raw and primal, the sound of a human voice cutting through the chaos. It drew the enemy's focus, their attention snapping to him. He welcomed it. They came at him in a surge, claws and blades slashing. He ducked, rolled, fired upward. Energy tore through them, but one slipped past, striking his side. Pain seared. He staggered, teeth gritted. But before the second blow could fall, the girl was there, her weapon slashing a line of light that split the attacker in two. She caught his arm, steadying him, her silver eyes blazing with fury. He nodded, breath ragged. Thanks. They fought on, side by side, until the chamber floor was littered with the remains of the invaders, but more were coming, too many. The walls trembled with the strain of constant impact, the ship groaning like a wounded beast. The leaders shouted, voices sharp with desperation. Daniel followed their gaze to the core. It pulsed erratically now, unstable, its streams of light flickering. The enemy wasn't just trying to kill them. They were trying to rupture the heart of the city itself. If the core failed, everything would die. The girl understood it too. He saw the realization in her eyes. She turned to him, speaking quickly, urgently, pointing to the weapon in his hands, then to the core. He didn't understand at first, until she mimed it. Destruction. Sacrifice. His stomach clenched. She wanted him to overload it, to detonate the core before the enemy could corrupt it, to take them all out. It was suicide. No, he whispered, shaking his head. But she insisted, her eyes shining with conviction. She touched his chest, then hers. She spoke his name, then the word she had learned from him. Saved. Daniel's throat tightened. This was it. The moment his first act of sacrifice had led to. The moment he had dreaded and yet known was inevitable. The enemy surged again, pouring into the chamber. Time was gone. He looked at her, memorizing the glow of her skin, the silver fire of her eyes, the way her name resonated like music in his memory, and then he nodded. Together they ran to the core. She placed her hand against it, singing in her tongue, her voice a command that made the streams of light flare. Daniel raised his weapon, pressing it against the heart of the energy. It pulsed violently, heat searing through him. She looked at him one last time, whispering his name. Daniel. He smiled, tears stinging his eyes. Beautiful. And then he fired. Light consumed everything. When he woke, he expected nothing but darkness. Instead, there was light. Gentle, warm, not the burning fire of the explosion, but the glow of life. He gasped, chest heaving, and realized he was lying on the floor of a chamber still intact. Around him, figures stirred, alien warriors, leaders, survivors. The core pulsed steadily once more, stable, alive, and she was there. Her hand rested on his, her silver eyes brimming with something he finally recognized fully: love. He had not died. Somehow, impossibly, the ship had responded. It had taken his intent, his sacrifice, and turned it into salvation without consuming him. Whispers rippled through the chamber. Eyes turned to him with awe, with reverence. A human who had given his body once to shield one of theirs, and again to save them all. He tried to sit, wincing, but she held him gently. Her voice shook as she spoke, the words broken but clear. You saved us. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He squeezed her hand, weak but steady. No, he whispered. We saved each other. Her skin glowed brighter, the light beneath it flaring in rhythm with the pulse of the ship itself. For a long moment, surrounded by her people, by the living city that had survived against all odds, Daniel felt something deeper than survival. He felt belonging, and as the void outside slowly cleared of enemies, as the ship righted itself and the survivors of his own people waited somewhere out there, in the stars, he knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. Humanity was not alone. And maybe, just maybe, neither were they.